So social deprivation, I understand to mean that someone is lacking minimally adequate access to decent social contact. So someone who is held in solitary confinement in prison, or someone who's held in isolation in medical quarantine, or in isolation in an immigration facility, those would all be examples of social deprivation, and indeed those are examples of coercive social deprivation. Social deprivation can also be not someone in isolation, but someone who's experiencing a brutal environment. So many prison settings are brutal social environments, and so the access to decent human contact is what's missing there. And then the last category is social deprivation that's not coercive, but incidental. So someone who is chronically acutely lonely and unable to seek out social contact, they too can be socially deprived. So that's a tough question. One possible explanation is that we tend to ignore the basics. So there's no enumerated human right to breathable air. And I think it's partly, we sort of take it for granted that there will be clean, breathable air. But in that case, it may actually be not that it's basic, but that one's not at the moment under threat. So it may not be the basicness, but social rights are a bit of a strange beast for human rights, in that human rights are a very individualistic kind of concept. It's, it's your rights as a person, as an individual. This is the sort of the stop point of how we can treat people. And so we tend to see people as individuals, as isolated, autonomous individuals who come to the human rights table and then assert political rights to vote, to participate in democracy, to have a fair trial, to assert rights to basic subsistence, food, education, water. And as a package, human rights tend, although there are social rights of a sort enumerated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenants, social rights as a category tend not to get a lot of attention. I think it's because that we have this very individualistic picture of what human rights are about. So if you look at the neuroscience literature and the psychology literature, the evidence is pretty clear that social deprivation, that's the term I'm using, but chronic acute loneliness, and particularly coercive isolation or brutal social conditions, they have a very negative effect mentally, emotionally, physically. There's a link that neurologists suggest exists between chronic loneliness and obesity, increased vascular resistance, rapid progression of Alzheimer's disease, early mortality. It essentially stimulates the fight or flight response. We respond to isolation in the same way that we respond to pain, thirst, hunger, or fear. And in the most extreme context of coercive social deprivation, there, the response, the negative effects are even more clear. People can become, they can hallucinate, they can become self-mutilating, and can become suicidal. And the long-term effects of that can last after the person is released. So that, it depends a bit on whether this right could be subsumed under other rights that have, some recognition already. So, taking coercive social deprivation, if that were part of a right against torture or a right against cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, then there is human rights law that this right would just naturally fall under. But not all social deprivation is torturous, because not all of it is coercive or intended. When people are incidentally socially deprived, there's no one trying to be cruel or trying to torture them. So there, we'd have to have a different account of what human rights law requires of states in terms of the protection of the people for whom they're responsible. But there are definitely some starting points in terms of right to health, a right to meet your basic needs. Given that maintaining your social connections is important for the maintenance of your social abilities and your cognitive and physical abilities, if that right isn't protected, then many other rights we take for granted would also be under threat. So the government would have to start by looking at its own institutions and policies. So does this government use solitary confinement in prison? Many countries like the UK, for example, claim not to use solitary confinement in prison, but you can be held in isolated detention for 2 weeks, and that number is given by politicians as one that this is not torture. If it's only 2 weeks, it's not torture. But from what I understand from psychologists, the data do not support that, or that the data is not able to corroborate that statement that's made by politicians. So a state would have to start by looking at what kinds of practices it's using in its criminal justice system, in its healthcare system. Sometimes medical quarantine is a necessary evil, to contain a disease, to protect the larger population. But what efforts are being made to mitigate the effects of the isolation on the person who has to be quarantined? So states can start with looking at their own policies and practices, and then there's a more general question about our culture. How have we set up our urban environment? What opportunities do people have for incidental contact? How difficult is it for families to stay in touch with people who are held in institutions? All of those sort of broader, softer questions come under a state's responsibilities with respect to social needs.